Hi, my name is Carolyn Lyon, and this is a paper for a research seminar at the Shakespeare Institute at the University of Birmingham. This recording is happening on the grounds of Southern Oregon University in Ashland, Oregon. This paper has been in the process of development for several months, and I'd like to thank everyone involved. Because this is a YouTube video, there will be two parts. In this part, part one, I will be looking at theory, and in part two, I will apply theory to The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare. Peace in an Age of Technological Reproducibility, or Real Humanity, Part 1. This paper argues that the concept of reproducibility, as defined by the 20th century philosopher Walter Benjamin, can radically illuminate The Merchant of Venice. In so doing, it can initiate a new criticism of merchant, one I call suprapolitical. The suprapolitical relies on present merchant criticism, but questions it at the same time. It not only resists the appropriation of literature and drama on stage and off. In identity politics, it attempts to release or clean up the appropriation once it has happened. In merchant, I claim, it has happened. Merchant has been appropriated by an attachment to an identity of victimization. This is a sensitive subject, and it does concern, among several religions, Judaism. The dilemma is that there isn't one way to describe Judaism, Jewish thought, or the Jewish people. There is not a norm in Judaism, though some might think their way is the norm. Just as Shakespeare scholars James Shapiro, John Gross, Julia Lupton, and Stephen Greenblatt cannot speak as absolute representatives of a one Judaism, neither can I. Honestly, no one can. That's because Judaism is never set. It is always evolving and in continual spiritual and cultural conversation. What I can do is portray what I see as important pieces of that conversation. This brings us to a quote from Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of England. Sacks has claimed in a recent teaching that victimization is not, and never has been, the chosen path of Judaism. He says, "Do not define yourselves by victimization. Define yourselves as a free moral agent." I agree that a vast majority of Talmudic rabbis and rabbinic scholars certainly define Judaism by something other than victimization. The appropriation of merchant, therefore, to defend Judaism, as if Judaism is founded on racial victimization, is an appropriation that relies, I contend, on a false principle. Such criticism of merchant, soon to be discussed, even in the defense of Judaism, bases that defense on questionable precepts. What result, we will soon see, therefore, is a loss of balance when considering the many themes of merchant, as well as a misunderstanding of an ancient tradition and religion. Reproducibility, a concept of Walter Benjamin, can help to release that appropriation and end the related hypocrisy. This is a good moment for a tangent. After a question posed by the scholar Jennifer Ann Bates at the recent Shakespeare and Philosophy Conference, I want to clarify what I mean by hypocrisy. Bates states in Hegel and Shakespeare on Moral Imagination that hypocrisy and self-denial, according to Hegel, is a crime against conscience. This described crime occurs when someone who knows something about the universal, Hegel's language, is misrepresenting it to themselves and to the other. Bates, though, emphasizes that often this misrepresentation is unintended. In other words, sometimes people are simply not aware of the impact of present modes of perception on their fears or predispositions. As Bates has suggested, there is little we can do to free ourselves from the monolithic mistakes in history, or from the resulting modes of perception into which we are born. Nonetheless, this paper aims to try to release merchant from its attachment to victimization, which has dominated post-Holocaust criticism. Once again, this paper claims that the philosopher Benjamin can help to release the appropriation of merchant and its attachment to victimization by means of his theory of reproducibility. First, I will therefore explain the concept of reproducibility. Then I will examine how reproducibility relates to theories such as new historicism, presentism, and cultural materialism. I will then explore how reproducibility releases merchant from its appropriation. Victimization is certainly a theme of Merchant. What reproducibility shows us, though, is that by attaching ourselves only to that theme, we just perpetuate it. We also lose touch with other themes, which themselves can open doors with transformative visions. Walter Benjamin was born in 1892 into a successful bourgeois non-practicing Jewish family. Benjamin was a radical in that he refused to adapt to the current academic tendencies in philosophy. Benjamin's unconventional views attracted him to the communism of playwright Bertolt Brecht and to the Jewish mysticism of scholar Gershom Scholem. Within Jewish mysticism, or Kabbalah, there is concealment. God, or Ein Sof, is represented by constructs and is also concealed by these same constructs. Every number and letter in Jewish mysticism conceals a door to a supernal power or to a shared meaning. Kabbalah concerns itself with access through those figurative doors. This paper claims that Benjamin was not a Kabbalist, but liked to play the Kabbalist. He concealed much within his writings. Hannah Arendt contends that to her friend Benjamin, things revealed themselves through their secret meaning. Concealment, therefore, to Benjamin in Nazi Germany not only marked his daily existence, it was philosophical. Benjamin's article, The Work of Art in the Age of its Technological Reproducibility, therefore contains a partly concealed political mystical message about human meaning, as much as a discourse about art. Benjamin in this article envisions a day in which man defines himself no longer by his authenticity, but by how well the self can be reproduced. He claims that it is impossible to reproduce art mechanically and to keep its quintessence because the historical testimony is affected. A church is always in its courtyard. When it ends up on the wall of our living room, it no longer is what it claims to be. It is no longer the church. According to Benjamin, it is the vastly reproduced image of the church. Therefore, it loses historical testimony. Historical testimony is not only who we are genealogically, religiously, culturally, spiritually, joyfully, and painfully. It is who we are as cemented in the inchoate centers of our art and being. To illustrate reproducibility, Benjamin aligns the cinematographer with the surgeon and the painter with the magician. He states, "The attitude of the magician who heals a sick person by a laying on of hands differs from that of the surgeon who makes an intervention in the patient." Let me repeat that quote by Benjamin. "The attitude of the magician who heals a sick person by a laying on of hands differs from that of the surgeon who makes an intervention in the patient. The magician maintains the distance between himself and the person treated, but increases it greatly by his authority. The surgeon greatly diminishes the distance by penetrating the patient's body." While the cinematographer, and I use this word because Benjamin used it when film was new, creates a seemingly vivid reality, it is not real. It is created. Someone makes something to look like something real and calls it real. It's like this. In the United States, a certain frozen pizza is made with something called capital R real cheese. But it is not cheese. It just has that trademark. So people think it is cheese. The trademark belies the authenticity of its identity. We are no longer defined by that which is transmissible within our origins. We are defined by our trademark, capital R, real humanity, or our facsimile, the copies made from the facsimile, and by how well we can be copied. In a strange way, this loss of truth and authenticity caused by reproducibility can be aligned to the perverse dynamic as unfolded by Jonathan Dallimore in Sexual Dissidence, Augustine to Wilde, Freud to Foucault. The perverse dynamic, Dallimore claims, is violent, destabilizing, and brutal. It involves the rooting of the perverse in that which is authentic, thereby making it unauthentic. At the same time, though, both the perverse and the now unauthentic become normalized. Dallimore uses this theory to explain the homoerotic. The homoerotic roots itself into a being. The The whole being is then taken over by the unauthentic. In this sense, to Dallimore, the unauthentic is a positive occurrence. I suggest that reproducibility does something similar. It involves a rooting of replicas of self in the true, authentic self. Therefore, it violently deposes the soul, or aura. As Benjamin says, the shelling of the object from its hull, the destruction of the aura, extracts sameness even from what is unique. Again, the shelling of the object from its hull, the destruction of the aura, extracts sameness even from what is unique. In other words, according to Benjamin, the true self is taken from its protection and destroyed. This happens when it is reproduced so many times that it becomes generic. It no longer exists. Our aura no longer exists. To Benjamin, therefore, the unauthentic is not a positive occurrence, as it seems to be to Dallimore. Benjamin's statement about the hulls is not surprisingly aligned with Jewish mysticism, and can therefore be further understood by means of it. The image of the shelling of the object is directly related to Lurianic Kabbalah, or that of Rabbi Luria of the 16th century. Luria has been known as the great early modern rabbi. In Lurianic Kabbalah, the hulls are compartments which safekeep our authentic essence. Then they break. The scraps of the hulls are spread all over the earth, and the authentic essence dissipates. This breakage is referred to by Gershom Scholem in his book Kabbalah as the spiritual catastrophe. As a slight tangent, this paper, in its attempt to release Merchant from its appropriation, is symbolically pointing to an ensuing step in Lurianic Kabbalah. This is the cleaning up of the broken hulls, or tikkun olam in Hebrew, the small contribution in the cleaning up of the world. In Benjamin's philosophy, once the hulls have been shelled, however, or broken, there is not a tikkun olam. I think, though, that had Benjamin lived beyond the catastrophe in his era, the Holocaust, he may have been open to finding that same greater meaning. This could use more explanation. Returning to Dallimore, 25 years after the unfolding of the perverse dynamic, he spoke about meaning at the Radical Mischief Conference in Stratford-upon-Avon. He said, "Sometimes shared meaning can transcend antagonism in ways which are different from compromise." This move from the perverse dynamic to a precious meaning on the part of Dallimore is similar to that which could have occurred on the part of Benjamin. Benjamin, if he had lived, would have possibly developed reproducibility to a call for a transcendence, perhaps to a type of tikkun olam, as I have described. His life was tragically cut short during World War II by his suicide while attempting to escape occupied France and then Spain. Returning to his analysis from the 1930s, Benjamin claims that reproducibility leads to war. The aura of self is finally replaced by what Benjamin calls the aesthetization of politics, which itself glorifies war and perpetuates it. He says, humankind has reached the point where it can experience its own annihilation as a supreme aesthetic pleasure. This brings us to the present. I do not think we know the extent by which reproducibility governs our present mode of perception. As Terence Hawkes has claimed in Shakespeare and the Present, the unawareness of the present can be dangerous. We apply reproducibility exponentially to past and future eras, and to their related violence. We not only, as Bruce Morgan terms it in his article, Benjamin Resituated, add soil to the understanding of historical figures, such as Shakespeare. I claim that we reproduce that action. We add more and more soil, robotically and naturally bury Shakespeare in that same soil. The more we blindly act on reproducibility, the more we reapply it, myopically, and bury agents of meaning, such as Shakespeare, as well as meaning itself. This brings us to historicitism. Stephen Greenblatt states in Shakespeare's Cure for Xenophobia that what you inherit, what you receive from a world that you did not fashion, but that will do its best to fashion you, is at once beautiful and repellent. you somehow have to come to terms with what is ugly, as well as what is precious. This statement shows an understandable need to somehow reconcile a despicable era in human history. While the scholar Hugh Grady points to the history of philosophy to explain new historicism, I'd like to add that Greenblatt seems to want to negotiate impossible past tragedies. The intellectualizing of any devastating paradigm rupture has not only been expressed in the poetry of Lamentations, but in the observations of Holocaust survivors such as Elie Wiesel and Martin Buber. Stephen Greenblatt himself famously admits, "I begin with the desire to speak with the dead." Of course, Hawkes wisely responds that he speaks with the living, and while there is certainly a rationale there, one that I endorse in this paper, it must be emphasized that at the possible nexus of that conversation is the violence out of which the Jewish people have been continually experiencing an understandably difficult emergence. In review, reproducibility, such as in today's world, pirates our minds beyond our realization. When Shakespeare scholars define Shakespeare through the prism of reproducibility, by the seeming goal to reproduce his economic, social, and political setting, they are therefore superimposing our present mode of perception on his work. However, Shakespeare did not live in an age of mechanical reproducibility. He lived before, as Andy Mousley projects, existential questions were marginalized by culturally specific issues. Shakespeare's work, therefore, transforms into a facsimile forced on it by people living 400 years in the future. Shakespeare, by means of this definition, loses the quintessence and, in the language of Benjamin, the aura of Shakespeare himself. In this way, ironically, Shakespeare's historical testimony is not rediscovered. It is, in Benjamin's words, compromised. This ends part 1. In part 2, we will be looking at how all of this can be applied to The Merchant of Venice by William Shakespeare.